This webinar is brought to you by Neogen Corporation, marketer of the food safety industry's strongest, most complete line of diagnostic testing products. Patricia Wester is currently president of PA Wester Consulting, where she utilizes her broad experience in food safety and accredited certification auditing as an active SME on a wide range of FSMA training products. She has contributed to the development and delivery of recognized curriculum for preventive controls and food safety auditor certification schemes. She is an active contributor to the regulatory process and an advocate for advancing the food safety profession. She is a FSPCA lead instructor for human foods and an approved applicant for animal foods.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate both Neogen and everyone on the call today taking the time out of their busy schedules to learn a little bit about what's coming down the road. I know that for the animal food industry, it has been somewhat challenging to access information at this point. Know that courses are now finally underway, instructor courses. I believe the second one is coming out the end of this month, so you will be able to access that information fairly soon, which is a good thing. So for today, we will look at the general topics that are involved in it. We will kind of go through at a very, very high level on some things. I will go fairly quickly in terms of the content, but that is simply so that we can get to everything that's involved in the compliance with the regulation. This information that you see on the screen is actually taken directly from an FDA presentation. It is not part of the regulation, but I think it is important for everyone to understand their perceptions. Pet food had a unique history in the development of the preventive controls regulations in that originally it was slated under the human food rule. If you go back and look at the original Federal Register notices, things like that, you'll see it there. However, they did pull it out and bring it over under the animal food rule, but it does have some unique characteristics that separate it in that group as well. So they're looking at dog and cat food, basic household pets, treats, very specifically based on their history with issues in recent years. Vitamin, minerals, and other supplements also qualify as pet food, as do their ingredients. So as we go forward through the course, I know on our call today we may have a little bit of everyone involved, but this is going to be the primary focus. Nope, wrong way. There we go. So if you look at the Preventive Controls rule for animal food, you're going to find it in several subcompartments, subdivisions. Typically, Subpart A, which would have general provisions, doesn't have a lot of information for, as far as industry is concerned. That is not the case in either of these two rules. In these two, in the Animal Food Preventive Controls rule, you will find some very specific requirements in Subpart A, particularly as they apply to personnel and management's responsibility. So in our first bullet point here, you'll notice I've condensed you, management, the owner, operator, agent in charge. This is phrasing used throughout the regulation that all basically has the same meaning. But it puts that responsibility now for management to ensure all employees who are involved in the food production process, animal food or human food for that matter, are qualified to perform their assigned duties. They must have the necessary combination of education, training, and experience. Anybody who followed Peanut Corporation of America's issues, you will note that they had a quality assurance manager, quality control manager that was previously their receptionist. So that might be a bit of a challenge under these rules. Not only is corporate required to provide qualified employees, but they also must provide them training. So this is training specifically in food hygiene, food safety, employee health and hygiene are mentioned. Those are two topics that you're going to have to go ahead and incorporate for everyone. This is a corporate responsibility, and I want to make sure that that point is clear. This is not the head of QA or QC. This is the most senior management official available to the business unit. I know that within a lot of companies, given your structure, you're going to have to determine who that is. And the reason you need to do that, and I start with that topic, is eventually they are going to be required to sign and date the food safety plan, indicating they're aware of what you plan to do, what the plan covers and incorporates, and it directly links them for their accountability in the process. I always encourage my students in my training classes to start that process early. You don't want to wait to the end when your food safety plan is done and walk into the corner office and say, "Excuse me, sir, please sign this." They might get a little testy if they're not aware of that coming in. There'll be plenty of information out in the marketplace for them to hear additional comments on what that means. But in the days of PCA and other Department of Justice criminal investigations, it is important that they get the message quickly. That is the only way you can then in turn, I think, justify the resource allocations you will need to successfully implement. One of the other terms that this part of the regulation identifies is qualified individual. If you have followed these rules back and forth over the several years we've been doing this and the multiple iterations of the rules, this originally was intended to be that most senior QA person. It is now meant to mean everyone. So everyone involved in the production process of animal food, even seasonal temporary personnel, must be qualified for the job duties or tasks as they're assigned. This may be a full-time employee of the company, or it may be a contract employee. It is not required that that person be a direct employee. This is a very important distinction because this is a first where across not just the line employee, not just perhaps maybe supervisory personnel, which also have some requirements. This applies to everyone. And then, of course, we have what is now the senior person, which is the Preventive Controls qualified individual, or the PCQI. Most of you are aware that curriculum is developed by the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance. It's a 2.5-day, 20-hour core curriculum that must be completed by at least one person per facility. To answer up front some general questions that typically come out here, no, this person does not have to be on site at all times, nor does there have to be any kind of specific requirements to who that person is. What's more important to me on what this job is not necessarily just that they take a course and get a certificate. It is understanding what that job is. Now, it doesn't, again, does not apply, just have to be one person to fulfill this role. In many cases, particularly where validations are concerned, most companies will reach out and get outside expertise. Hence, the reasoning behind having the person not be required to be an employee. But their job responsibility is the preparation of the food safety plan, whether it's directly or oversight, or for those of you that are currently under HACCP systems, leading the food safety team. They're responsible for validating any preventive controls. They're also responsible for any justifications where these things may deviate. This includes determining that a validation isn't required. You'll see as you go through the regulation in Part C, which is the preventive controls portion, records reviews are required, so they would designate who and when. Now, I did not advance that slide, so we'll go back here. They are also responsible for any justifications if those record review timelines deviate. They are looking at corrective action plans and making sure that they are being handled appropriately. And then, just like a HACCP plan, a food safety plan has a reanalysis component to it, and this is also under the purview of the PCQI. So that person that gets that certificate, as you can see, is responsible for a good deal more than just going out and getting a training course. But under the this particular section of the rule, where training is required, this is where we want to start looking early, because this is something you can begin at any time. And of course, the more time you give yourself to get this accomplished, the better off you'll be. So all personnel must receive training in food hygiene, food safety, for animals there, as well as human food. They also bring that in. And it primarily will cover health and personal hygiene. Disease communication is the big topic. They need to understand the significance of their own personal actions in compromising the quality of the product or safety of the product that you're producing. There are some additional qualifications listed for supervisory personnel in that they must be capable of recognizing compliant versus non-compliant behavior. So if they see someone not washing their hands, if they know that they're not following your hand washing protocol, and a lot of you who would just be implementing GMPs for the first time, these will be new for a great proportion of your employees, so you'll have to make sure that everyone is aware. The challenge for most in this particular area is on the disease issue. We should have programs that indicate personnel that are ill should not be at work and explain why they can be a source of contamination if they're, say, sick with hepatitis or norovirus or one of those things. It is much easier to deal with from a personnel perspective if you set a policy up front. This is handled at their onboarding or orientation training, and then they are aware. Following that same thought logic, then supervisors must be able to recognize behaviors that may indicate someone's sick and know what procedures they're to follow to pull them off the line and keep them from contaminating food. Note that the regulation specifies very specifically the date, type of training, and the person's trained that must be captured in records that will be subject to review under this part of the regulation. It is worth noting that this qualified individual or those that use the food safety team will need to process or that use that approach. You will need to look at how you identify what's the appropriate training. This is a topic that's coming under review right now through the alliances and others. And Jim, there we go. Okay, got it to transmit. That pretty much sums up Part A of the regulation. Note that for animal food, we are talking about Section 507. For animal products, the human food side is Section 117. But it is in this entire section, you'll find all of the regulations. Make sure you know what part, or subpart I should say, that you're looking at. So for year one, those that are required to comply in the as far as business size in the first round, your initial compliance is going to be to CGMPs, current good manufacturing practices. These are just exactly what they sound like. they are divided into these subcategories within the regulation. Personnel sets out a little bit more detail on what we just covered from subpart A. But then you go into plants and grounds, sanitation, and all of these different categories that describe the foundational or prerequisite type requirements that must be in place before you can build off of them to create your food safety plan. For purposes of today, we don't have a lot of time to spend with these, but I did want to show, since I was using personnel earlier, did want to show the kind of things you would find in the CGMPs. So, reasonable measures and precautions to ensure that all persons working in direct contact with animal food contact surfaces, and packaging materials conform to hygienic practices. So they describe in sub-bullets here some of the requirements that are necessary. Hand washing is the biggest one, and the one that is most difficult to ingrain in people's thought processes and daily habits. Jewelry and anything else, particularly above the waist, that can fall or become a physical contaminant to food, has to be secured, whether or not, depending on what you produce. Outer clothing, such as white coats or frocks or smocks or whatever you call them, whether or not those are being used in locker areas to store other personal belongings, come in here, and then as a blanket, just to make sure that there's everything in there, that they didn't miss anything. It's the last bullet of any other necessary precautions to protect against the contamination of the product. There is one note from the preamble of the final rule that's worth calling out here when we are talking about CGMPs, and that is this limited labeling concern or issue around animal and human food byproduct that's coming through. It speaks to FDA's legal authority to require this labeling, and it simply means that if you are receiving human food byproduct, it needs to be labeled in transit, in process, so that it doesn't get mixed up. It is not an official finished product type of labeling requirement. It is much more a focus on making sure you know what you're receiving, what they sent you is what they said it was, those kind of things. So now we get to the heart and core of the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. You'll notice I've used the acronym of HARPC, the alliance that is developing these trainings for the PCQI frowns on that acronym, but industry has pretty much adopted it, and quite frankly, it's much easier to say than hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls every time you need to do it. This is the component that will come in year 2 of whatever business size compliance bracket you're in. We have a table on that later at the end of the presentation. But these are the more complicated, more HACCP-like requirements that you'll need to develop as you're working through this process. First of all, it's an overview look at what must be in the food safety plan. I have left citations in for those of you who want to look at the different pieces and where they're found in the rule. But you must prepare or oversee the preparation of the written hazard analysis. As we go through today and learn what types of hazards those may be, if we get to hazards that require controls, then we will apply the written preventive controls that we will deploy to control those hazards. Where applicable, a supply chain program, which is the entire component there for the requirement is in subpart E. A written recall plan is required, but it's very specific as to where. And then procedures for the control or management of your preventive controls, and that is corrective action procedures, verification procedures, and monitoring procedures that tell you the control is working as intended and is being used consistently each and every time. So in a quick look, we'll just look at these in a little bit of overview, and then we'll go back and look at particularly the hazard analysis in some detail. The hazard analysis under FSMA is a two-step process whereby you're going to identify the hazards that you need to consider out of all the known hazards, and then you're going to evaluate those hazards, which includes a risk assessment of the likelihood they could occur and the severity of illness or injury if they do occur. When we have hazards that reach that criteria, then we must use preventive controls. Preventive controls are designed to manage those hazards, and we'll go through in detail what they are. But for those, then we have corrective actions and corrections, which are what will you do if things don't go as planned. Perfect, mistakes happen. They have a complete process in and of their own, where you take steps, you do a root cause analysis, you determine what happened, take steps to prevent it from happening again. But first and foremost, your primary objective is to make sure that you have identified any potentially impacted product and that someone with the appropriate training and background assesses that product before it is released into commerce. Corrections, on the other hand, they're a little bit different. There's something that happens in, say, a minor step where if you did a pre-op inspection, you look, the equipment isn't quite clean, so you re-clean, re-sanitize, start over. Those are the kind of things that you would address through corrections rather than full-blown corrective actions. Monitoring is exactly what it states, which is it's the procedure or the process for making sure that everything is being conducted as we plan, the temperatures are where they're supposed to be, the pH, the water activity, whatever that parameter is, that it is being monitored. Now, what's of note here, since temperature and particularly refrigeration temperatures can be a big component of this, there was a specific question and answer made on the use of exception records, which is if you have an alarm chart recorder type thing on your cooler that only notifies you if the cooler begins to warm up. That is an example of an exception record that is allowed to be used in the system. Then we move into the broader area of verification activities. These include validation, and it makes it a little more complicated to define it that way, but that is the way they've done it. And verifying that all of your other actions and activities are being conducted as designed. Now, of note here, you'll see I've included product testing and environmental monitoring as possible verification activities. And you will see in the regulation a lot of language that says, as appropriate to the food facility nature of the control and its role in the overall food safety system. For each of these components, it will be on the burden of the facility to determine the frequency of these events, what is appropriate and what is not. So the same thing goes, in this case, the language is used when an animal food is exposed to the environment prior to packaging, and the packaged product does not receive a treatment, such as a high pressure treatment in the package, or otherwise include some form of control in the formulation, these programs are required. They're not optional, they are required. So it will be a significant change for many, but it is the approach that is taken to ensure that where the risk is higher, the more effective controls are used and more documentation on those controls. So to summarize, the major components of the food safety plan are the hazard analysis, preventive controls for those hazards determined to be unwarranted. Preventive controls include process controls, sanitation controls, supply chain controls, and recall plans, and this other controls as necessary, which you'll see later on, includes this training. That is the example that they use to identify what they mean, meaning FDA, as an other control. Where controls are used, you have monitoring procedures to write, corrective action procedures, your verification procedures, and then, and as the final part, reanalysis and record keeping. We won't focus too much on that part today. What we're going to focus on here are the preventive controls, what they are, and what they're intended to do. Preventive controls, this definition comes from the regulation itself in 507 subpart A, 507.3, it's where all the definitions are. It says risk-based, reasonably appropriate procedures that if you knew what to do in food safety, this is what you would do. Based on current scientific understanding, essentially best practices. They include controls at CCPs, for those of you more familiar with HACCP. If there are any that exist, say you have a heat step. But it also includes controls at other points rather than just CCPs that are appropriate for animal food safety. For example, if you're controlling a hazard with a CGMP, that CGMP can be considered a preventive control. We'll show you how that works out in the documentation. But when you establish a process control, this is going to be your more traditional heat steps, product formulation steps that were CCPs under a HACCP system. However, this is not necessarily HACCP, so you have to kind of get two sets of thought processes going and know that you have to, if you have a control, a heat step that has to achieve a certain temperature or pressure or both for a certain time, then that is your critical limit. Only now, since it applies across many other types of controls, you'll see the term parameter used. Essentially, that parameter is the minimum or maximum value or combination of values that any of these must be controlled to prevent the hazard. So it's a lot of garbled language, and I realize it's in many ways circular in thought. Essentially, it's establishing the range of acceptable and non-acceptable, whether it's a visual check, whether it's in the case of a process control, and every batch recording of temperatures or pH or water activity, whatever that is. But for each control, you must have a line in the sand that says, beyond this is not okay and up to this is okay. For sanitation controls, it's a little bit different in a way that it's hard to say where and when exactly. So it says practices and processes that we make sure that this facility is clean, the equipment is clean enough to prevent it becoming a hazard to the product. They specifically call out contact surfaces, as including contact surfaces of utensils and equipment, hand equipment, and hands themselves are one of the single largest sources of concern here. So you'll have a program in your sanitation that not only addresses how you clean equipment, but now how you specifically clean contact surfaces, the utensils and so forth, and what steps do you take to prevent cross-contamination. Note that it includes raw materials, product in process, contact surfaces, and direct contact food packaging materials. So it kind of is a broad scope. I know many of the animal food, pet food processes or dry processes, extruded kibble, those kind of things, it's high temperature and high pressure, are used along with heat. However, many of those then have a palatant or some kind of flavor-based applied after that heat step. So you'd want to be particularly careful with contact surfaces in those areas to make sure they did not contribute to recontamination of the product. Now, a supply chain control is a preventive control that would be put in place or is in place for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient where somebody's doing it before you receive it. So if you bought fully cooked something for a raw material, then whoever, and you don't do anything to it but blend it, maybe add something else to it. The control that's of the hazard that is of concern is that heat step at your supplier, not you. You're not doing anything to control any microbiological hazards. Your supplier is managing all of those controls. That is when you must create a supply chain program. It is not applicable to every supplier you have. It applies to those suppliers where they control a hazard of that level. If you do have to create one of these programs, it must include, from your perspective, the use of approved suppliers, how you would determine what are the appropriate supplier verification activities, and that is based on the level of severity of the hazard. You must then conduct and document supplier verification activities, or if, for example, if it's a imported ingredient, you might get a copy of verification from the broker or the U.S. agent, and what the program must describe then what you do with that report. Note that the agency's perspective is that only you, meaning you, the receiving facility, can approve your own suppliers. Somebody else can do the actual verification activity, but just because they've been, say, audited and passed an audit, you cannot just accept them. You would have to go through a process that says you've reviewed the audit and approve them for yourself. Now, should you simply be a middle step in the supply chain, and the hazard in, say, a raw product is going to be controlled by someone else downstream from you, so now we're looking the other way and introducing this term customer that is used, you do not have to do anything here other than label for further processing. But you do need to get certain commitments from your customers. I'm not going to go into them today in this webinar, but know that they exist. They are called written assurances, and they do carry a significant legal burden. So you will want to look at that carefully if that is where you fall in the system. The other important component of the supply chain program is that what do you do if your supplier has had a preventive control issue or any kind of control issue. They could be under a HACCP, it could be a USDA facility, whatever. If their controls fail, what are your steps? So then therefore you have to have a corrective action plan for supply chain. It may include whatever they've done, depending upon the nature of their nonconformance, but at the very least, what you will do in review of records and reanalysis of your food safety plan and any effect that it has had. Know that in any corrective action plan, the key is the immediate identification of any product impact. Lock that back door before it can get out until you have time to assess it. Then you can go through the processes of determining what happened. The recall plan and other preventive controls, these are the last in our list of preventive controls. Again, a recall plan is only required where a preventive control is used. So if you produce products that don't have preventive controls, technically you don't have to have a recall plan. I realize that there are other business reasons that many people have recall plans, so I highly recommend them. I'm not saying stop doing them just because this says you don't have to. I'm just pointing out that from a regulatory perspective, they can only require them for the products that have a hazard that requires a preventive control. And then, as I said, these are the hygiene training and GMP practices where they may fall into a preventive control category. So that kind of takes a real high-level 30-minute look at preventive controls. Now, there are certain places where they're not required. They're not required, that possibly could not be consumed without an application of an appropriate control, say by the end user. This is a little more easy to apply in human food, I think, than in animal food, but that is an option. You don't have to do it if you rely on your customer, as I mentioned before, that they will be the ones responsible for applying it. This is where we get into, this describes this labeling thing. The animal food is not processed to control whatever that hazard is between you and your customers. And then a brief description here of this phrase, written assurance, which I think will be a bit more complicated getting commitments from customers downstream that bear this legal weight. But that's not the topic of today's discussion. Just recognize that they're there. So now I think for anyone looking at compliance at this stage in the game for animal food, the hazard analysis is where the most important part of your time should be spent. And so I want to make sure that we do just that the hazard analysis as it is done here is done thoroughly. It is the heart and backbone of your food safety plan. And it has certainly been expanded to go beyond what we would have traditionally seen under HACCP regulation. So currently it is any biological, chemical, which now includes radiological, or physical agent that can cause illness or injury. So that encompasses, as the agency describes, all the hazards in the whole wide world. We narrow that down a little bit into known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, which have known or has the potential to be associated with this facility or with this type of food. These are similar to the HACCP language of reasonably likely to occur, and at that point you have to kind of draw the similar parallel. There were issues in the comments supplied to the agency that said they didn't want it as if they were the same as HACCP versus not. So we came up with, or the agency did, came up with known or reasonably foreseeable. Now we come to what in the interim rules for this were called significant hazards. However, that language is challenged as well. And now it is a hazard requiring a preventive control. So a hazard requiring a preventive control is a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, which in the absence of control, you need to establish one or more preventive controls to significantly minimize or prevent the hazard from happening. And then the components to manage them as we've described. So it is awkward language, and I recognize that. But apparently someone challenged use of the term significant hazard. Felt like it created tiers of hazards, which essentially does. But unfortunately, instead of being able to say it's a significant hazard, now we have to say a hazard requiring a preventive control is a hazard that requires a preventive control. It's not my favorite phrase. It says we're identifying hazards. I wanted to point out what happens here in chemical, which is where there are some distinctions for animal food. Radiological hazards were added across the board. There are some simple ways for you to address what those are. You are not responsible for preventing nuclear accidents. However, by declaring it a hazard, it does allow the agency with the legal means to pull product off the market if it is contaminated, such as we saw in the Japanese issue just a little while back. More importantly, for animal and pet food, are nutrient deficiencies or toxicities. So that is unique to the animal food product category. The concept that in most or many cases the product you provide is the sole dietary source of nutrition for the animal, and therefore it must be complete. It cannot be as well as inadequate, as the example given here for cat food, in certain components, or as well as toxic, such as excessive vitamin D or copper for the animals as shown. So you will have to address that hazard as well as physical hazards. Now, physical hazards are a fact of life in many of the raw materials we all use. Rocks and stones and pebbles and things, anything that comes out of Mother Nature is not going to come out perfectly clean. Metal fragments, on the other hand, are introduced as a component of our production technique. And just for simplicity's sake, I will note that if you use metal detection, it is considered a process control, so just know that that's where you'll apply that going forward. The regulation also identifies additional ways that hazards can enter the food. So known or reasonably foreseeable hazards also must consider hazards that occur naturally. They're a component of the product or its traditional harvesting technique, such as grain crops that are exposed to wild animals and therefore need to be considered for salmonella, maybe E. coli, some of the other pathogens. The hazard may be unintentionally introduced, i.e. contaminated, recontaminated, either through production or processing or harvesting, whatever. And then this third bullet point, which is intentionally introduced. However, this term has been divided. You have intentionally introduced for economic gain, which is the one that's enforced here, and then intentionally introduced in terms of purposes of under food defense, that particular is covered under the other regulation. So the classic example here is melamine in pet food. I think we all know what happened there, but that was an example of a hazard intentionally introduced for economic gain. So this will give you kind of a look at how those two things flow together and come into your identified hazards that you need to look at and evaluate for risk and severity. So once you've gotten all of those incorporated, we go to the evaluation step, which is the risk assessment. This is the part to look at the severity of the illness or injury if the hazard were to occur, as well as the probability that it may occur. So I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with any of the risk matrices, but they're out there and they can be used. The hazard evaluation must include environmental pathogens. Remember, when essentially you have what they call an RTE, animal food, or an animal food that's exposed to the environment prior to packaging and undergoes no treatment or formulation steps that can prevent growth. What's the most important thing to out of this entire presentation is if you have all your hazards identified, and you're ready to begin your assessment, these are the required considerations that are in the regulation. This greatly expands anything that pre-existed in any HACCP plan. Matter of fact, there's only about half or 5 that were originally involved in HACCP compared to this list here. So you have to look at the formulation, condition and design of equipment, traffic patterns in the layout of the facility, along with sanitation, including employee hygiene. These are all new hazard evaluation considerations that you need to document. Now, you may determine they don't apply, but you must have documentation that says you considered them, and here's why you say they did not apply if you decide not to. The point number 10, if you source seasonally shifting ingredients, that come from various regions as the market changes throughout the year. You source grains that are subject to mycotoxin development over time. You're going to have to include all of that, depending upon whether it's from a different source, different supplier, or as everyone shifts from that market, whatever it is. These are now all of the issues that need to be considered in there. So now that kind of wraps up the core of it. I think we have a few more minutes since we were a little bit late starting, so I'm going to quickly go through these components. Corrective actions, primarily noting that they fall very specifically around pathogens during testing for product and environmental monitoring, and they all have the same components. This material will be available to you to review. You must have corrective actions if any of these situations apply. You didn't have a properly implemented preventive control. The preventive control wasn't effective. Your records were incomplete. And in some cases, it may trigger a complete reanalysis of the plan. Same thing with your monitoring, written procedures, including frequency for how they're to be performed. Make sure that that frequency is adequate. Document what's being done, and use and of course you can use exception records where needed. We discussed a little bit about what corrections are. I personally would record them. It will tell you certain things are being done or not. Make sure you track that data. Use it. This gives you a bulleted list of your verification activities and gets you into particularly this verification of implementation and effectiveness. That will go to a very specific set of records you'll need to keep. Validations are required for your preventive controls to make sure they are adequate to control the hazards, plain and simple. You can do a literature search, a review of what's going. I know some of the trade associations grouped together and actually did some validation work on the extrusion process for so that most would have access to it. But not everything has to be validated. There's time frames available in the regulations to when they do, but note that over and beyond this, you don't validate sanitation controls. You verify them. You're still using testing to verify, so don't get caught in the language. You don't validate the recall plan, and you don't validate, which wouldn't apply here, supply chain controls. There's that list right there. With the explanations that I've given. And then at the last bit, we have just 2 or 3 more slides and we'll be done. One of the key verification activities is make sure, first of all, that you're calibrating any of your instrumentation, but product testing and environmental monitoring. These are new for many in many cases, and I believe that it is very important you understand what it is you're doing and what the regulation requires so that you avoid any hiccups. Any product testing must be scientifically valid, which is representative of what you are producing. Identify the microorganism or other analytes if it's chemistry testing. Specify the procedures for identification of samples, and those samples IDs must tie back to your specific lots. Now, a lot is how you define it. But in purposes of testing, a lot can be expanded out to all the activity that occurred from the last time a complete sanitation was done. So very careful there. You should have procedures for how you're going to sample, the number and how often, what tests you're going to do, must be approved methods, and then what lab it is and any corrective actions that you take. Notably, we all discuss Salmonella and Listeria when we talk about typically environmental pathogens. However, they use a couple of other phrases there that are, that this microorganism of public health concern is another phrase that they use, but it's any pathogen capable of surviving and persisting in the environment. But note, you do not have to worry about spore control. For environmental monitoring, you need to follow all the same rules that you did with product testing. However, note the timing and frequency for collecting samples, whether it's operational, pre-op, post-sanitation, whenever it's done, and identifying the location and sampling sites ahead of time. So operational sampling, when you're doing environmental monitoring, is part of the process. And understand that in today's world, finding a positive periodically in a zone 2, 3, 4, well, zone 3 or 4 is considered a success. Your plan is then working. It is effective enough to find it if it's there, and then by golly, take the appropriate steps that need to be taken to address it. You want to make sure you take plenty of sampling in the area while it's still dirty. Identify what the source of that contamination was. Don't fall into the bluebell trap. And get yourself back into normal operating sampling. So to summarize, the animal food preventive controls rule does allow for staggered compliance. So within your business size category, you get to complete compliance for CGMPs in your first year, and then subpart C and the supply chain portions in the second. And training and qualifications are a corporate responsibility, as is signing the food safety plan. Hazard analysis is the heart of the plan, not the hero of the plan, and make sure you give yourself time and resources to do so. Document everything you do as part of the development process, because you'll look back one day and wonder what you meant or thought during a certain part. And know that having appropriate support and expansion on these environmental monitoring and product testing systems is absolutely critical. The Alliance training does provide some information, but I strongly encourage, if you need to do one of those programs, that you find a highly reputable one that focuses on finding the organism if it's in there. It's much better to find it on the floor than to get it out of your product when it's in commerce, because quite frankly, FDA has an aggressive sampling plan for animal foods in some places. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we got to the top of the hour, and I believe we have completed the webinar for today.
All right, thank you, Trish. There is an opportunity for our attendees to ask questions. There is a bar, you have to kind of look for it in your GoToWebinar dialog box that says questions. If you hit on the plus sign, you'll get the that area will fold out so you can actually ask the question. Just type it into that box, and we'll give folks just a minute or two to see if they have any questions before we move on. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about the implementation here of the controls is that the focus on environmental monitoring is new, I think, for a lot of folks, and the perspective that Tricia mentioned a couple times, that you want to find environmental monitoring positives is going to be different for a lot of folks. And
yes,
maybe, Trish, you could kind of just elaborate a little bit on that, what the theory of finding them in the environment, and the idea, as we've heard from some customers, that if you don't find them, that might be cause for concern. Might be a little bit new for folks as well.
it is counterintuitive, Jim, to say, what? But I came from a background in the meat industry, and I unfortunately was in it during the emergence of these environmental pathogens. We determined, unfortunately, through some very costly and tragic events, that if we monitor the room where the production is occurring and catch those pathogens before they can get up to contact surfaces and eliminate them then, that was the most effective method. Waiting until you test product, it's too late. We know we don't statistically sample enough product. We know that contamination events in product occur sporadically. In other words, it isn't like a giant inoculation or, adding it to the product consistently over the production day. It may only come out for 2 or 3 minutes, and then it disappears. These harborages, these areas where it hides in the equipment, are what we want to avoid. So we said, you know what, if we don't let it get up there, if we protect our raw materials, we don't bring it in, and we protect this area where it is, being, where we're producing product, then we're more successful. So we went from these elaborate random sampling systems, penny lottery things, and you name it, random number generators, to targeted testing that said we want to find it in before it gets on the product and can bury itself in our equipment. So, but we can't test the whole room every day, so what do? We start doing what we call this focused or targeted sampling. The areas most likely to have the organism. Drains being a place where we started, and once we convinced the regulatory agencies that that was a good thing and to not punish the finding of a positive, they understood as well that this actually was a true preventive step. So if you're sampling all year and you never find it, the likelihood is you're not sampling in the right places. If you find something on a floor in a drain because you're sampling a high probability area, that is a good thing, because then you'll go out, you'll look for where it may be. Through investigative sampling, you'll eliminate it and go back to normal operation and still protect your product. So it is counterintuitive. I have many people when I teach brag, I've never found, a positive. We've never had a positive. And for certain products, that's a very naive thought. Of course, you've probably got a positive. You've got exposure in areas where it can get in. So it's called search and destroy. Is a method that we use, and it is meant to find it. Sampling right after sanitation and sanitizer doesn't tell you anything. Those negatives don't help you. You want to find it, you want to look for it aggressively and find it before it gets to your product and get rid of it that way. And it's a concept that it does take a workshop, like a day, a good solid day, maybe day and a half, to go through all the reasons and why. That's a very good question, because it is totally counterintuitive.
All right, so we did have one question, but it leads us to the final slide, which is, will the presentation be available for future viewing? And the answer is yes. You can contact your sales representative here at Neogen for a copy of that presentation. Also want to thank Patricia for what was a terrific presentation. Lots of really good information. I think it's going to be very valuable for those who have been able to view it. Here is Trish's contact information for those of you who want to follow up and get any additional training or consulting. I'm sure she'd welcome questions. And with
Absolutely.
that, any closing questions, Trish?
No, I just want to thank Neogen for taking the proactive step, Jim, and putting this kind of information out for the animal food industry. I know they've been information starved, with the Alliance being a little bit behind for them. I wish them all the best. Certainly entertain questions, and know that they've got as good a resource in Neogen as any I've ever known in my 25 years in the industry. So I wish them all the best as they go out and tackle one of the biggest regulations in 100 years.
Well, terrific.